author, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. Rabbi Telushkin is really one of the leading thinkers of our generation. He has educated and inspired really a generation of American Jews by showing the beauty and the relevance of Judaism. He's the author, as you know, and many of you I'm sure are fans, he's the author of many wonderful books, including the 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, the 10 Commandments of Character, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and most recently, the author of the bestseller book, The Rebbe, about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, highly acclaimed, wonderful book. Rabbi Telushkin is speaking tonight about being a good person in a morally complex world. We're living in a very challenging world. It's a world where we're battling between good and so much evil, and it's a complex world. It reminds me about Rabbi Halberstam, the great Hasidic rabbi who said that earlier in my life I wanted to change the world. Then I realized, you know what, it's so hard to change the world. Let me try to change my community. Then I realized it's so hard to change a community. Let me work on my family. And then ultimately I realized, you know what, I can't change my family either. Let me try to change myself. And so we can't change the world and make a difference in the world, for Israel or anywhere, before we work on ourselves, changing ourselves. And with that, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Rabbi Joseph Telushkin.
I'm actually going to ask somebody if they can lend me their watch. I don't realize like I'm starting with a magic trick, but I use my cell phone now as my watch, but it's not good when you're speaking. Okay. I'm very, very happy to be here. Obviously, Beth Jacob has a national reputation, and your rabbi has a national reputation, so it's really an honor for me to be here. I'm actually fine if they would raise the lights, because I like to do certain interactive things during a speech, so I'm fine if I could see more of the audience. Good, thank you. By the way, a number of people asked me if I was speaking about the book on the Rebbe, so I'm not, but what I will do is at the beginning of the Q&A, I want to speak for a few moments about the book, because a number of people have wanted me to sign it and asked me to say something. One of the sad things that happened to Judaism in modernity is that the word religious came to be associated in people's minds exclusively with ritual observance. So that if 2 Jews are speaking about a third, a not uncommon experience in the Jewish community, and the question is raised, is so-and-so religious, the answer, yes or no, will be based only on ritual observance. He keeps Shabbat, he keeps kosher, he is religious. She doesn't keep Shabbat, she doesn't keep kosher, she's not. From which one could form the peculiar impression that in Judaism, ethics are an extracurricular activity. A nice thing, but not really all that necessary. Now, I say that as a person, as I'm sure you are here too, passionately committed to the significance of rituals in Jewish life. I'll just offer 3 reasons that come to mind. Without rituals, we don't have a sense of the sacred. Anybody here and here, speaking in the very traditional synagogue, you know that when you think of the Shabbat, the sense of the sanctity of the Shabbat very much comes through the ritual observances of the Shabbat. I'll just give one example. Jewish law ordains that the Shabbat is inaugurated with the lighting of 2 Shabbat candles. I'm curious, by a showing of hands, in how many of your families do you practice the custom of lighting an additional candle for each child in the house? I think it's about the highest percentage I've ever come across. I grew up in a household where my parents did that, and I was once speaking to Abraham Tversky. Has Rabbi Dr. Tversky ever spoken here in this series? He's an extraordinary figure. Tversky grew up in a Hasidic family in Milwaukee. He was the youngest child, and his parents practiced that custom. And he said to me, you know how meaningful it was to me as a child to know that every week there was more light in my parents' household because I existed? And what Tversky, of course, was speaking about was the capacity of rituals to also speak the language of poetry. Parents hopefully all tell their children that they love them, and hopefully tell them that often. And yet many children at the age of 25 are in therapist's office complaining that they never felt loved by their parents. So one of the things that ritual has the capacity to do is to speak in that poetic language and to give that sense of the sacred and that conveying of the sense of love. A second thought about rituals: without rituals we wouldn't have Jewish continuity. 3,200 years ago, a little over that, Jewish slaves were liberated from Egypt in an event written about, of course, in the second book of the Torah, in Smoke, and an event that Michael Walzer, the political philosopher at Princeton, has argued the story of the Exodus from Egypt has influenced more movements of social change than any other story in recorded literature. And yet, if we Jews didn't commemorate that story, that event, every Pesach, the story would still influence people, but I don't know if we as Jews would still survive as a people. So rituals have the capacity to bring the people together and to transmit their values from generation to generations. Let me give you another example of what I mean. Just call out the answer. What is the date of Abraham Lincoln's birth? February 12th. And Washington? February 22nd. The fact that you can answer that easily, those who do are probably all somewhat, or let's say 50 or older, because young people don't know the answer to that question. When I was growing up, we knew that February 12th was a day off from school because it was Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And it was observed on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. If it unfortunately fell on a Wednesday or a Thursday, you did not have a long weekend. Then, of course, what happened was they collapsed them all into President's Day, which honors all presidents, but in effect actually ended up honoring no presidents. By the way, here's just an interesting trivial detail. I wonder if anybody knows, how many of you know the answer? Who knows who shared a birthday with Abraham Lincoln literally on the same day and in the same year? It's a person actually, strangely enough, who is as famous as Lincoln, and there aren't too many people. You know the answer? No, it's not. You can guess the person who assassinated him, so you're not on Jeopardy. Charles Darwin. Strangely enough, I once saw in a book, Charles Darwin was born February 12, 1809. I was sure there was an error, but then I really checked it out. You know, astrologers must have a field day with that one. But in any case, now I totally forgot what I'm speaking about. Imagine if a group of rabbis got together and said, hey, you know what? We can increase attendance in shul on Yom Kippur if we standardize the date. Let's make Yom Kippur the first Sunday in October. You know, what would happen? Attendance would very quickly fall off, because part of the power of a ritual is that you have to adjust your life to the ritual. Any of you ever noticed that in 3,000 years of Jewish history, the holidays have never once arrived on time? Oh, the holidays are early this year. Oh, the holidays are late this year. When a ritual can be easily changed because it's inconvenient, it stops having any sense of the sacred or the significant about it. And the truth of the matter is, President's Day is simply an extended weekend with department store sales. It was different. We really did learn more about Lincoln and about Washington when we were growing up. Finally, a third point, rituals have the capacity to influence ethical behavior. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, and in those... Anybody else here go to the yeshiva of Flatbush? Actually, the president of your shul and I know each other from the yeshiva of Flatbush in Camp Masad, Jack Fenixstein, who is no longer known as Jackie, I don't think. Okay. Wait, was your first, was it S. Jack Fenixstein?
Let's not go there.
Okay. Okay. I was planning now to speak about Jack for a few minutes, but I'll drop it. Anyway. Okay, so, now I really forgot what I was saying. Oh yes, so when I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 50s, you definitely did not have kosher supervision over nearly as many products as you do today. In fact, when you would travel outside of New York, it was hard. if you grew up in a religious household, I did, obviously you were very punctilious about only buying meat from a kosher butcher. But when it came to most products, you would check ingredients. When it came to dairy, and other products. My friend Dennis Prager, we grew up right near each other in Brooklyn. Dennis once said to me, when I was 6 years old, the first words I learned to read in English were pure vegetable shortening only. He said it was not a bad thing to learn at the age of 6 that I couldn't have every candy bar in the candy store. So obviously the Bein Adam L'Makom, the laws between people and God, are very, very significant in Judaism. All I was commenting on, though, was that somehow, in the balance, they got emphasized in many ways at the expense of the ethical, which were not seen in the same way as being religious laws. And yes, this was false to the spirit of Judaism. Two of the greatest figures in Talmudic Judaism, Hillel and Akiva, put a particular emphasis on the law of love of neighbor. Hillel actually says, "Da'alech hasani," what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. He says that, by the way, it's interesting. Who knows the context in which Hillel makes that famous statement? He says, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. This is the Kol HaTorah Kula, the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and study. Who does he say it to? He says it to a non-Jew who approaches him and says, Gaireni al-Manat, convert me to Judaism on condition you can teach me the Torah while standing on one foot. So it's not like he was a rabbi giving a homily, let's say speaking before a group of non-Jews. Most of us, when you speak to members of another religion, you usually will try and emphasize that which you have in common with the other person. You try and find the base of the humanistic concerns. But Hillel was answering more of a legalistic question. The guy wanted to be converted, and it's in that context that Hillel stresses the supremacy of the ethical. And more than a century after Hillel, Akiva writes, love your neighbor as yourself, Zek Klal Gadol B'Torah, which can be translated as, this is a major principle or the major principle of the Torah. So as a result, I was motivated a number of years ago, and it was a long project, to try and collect in one volume the ethical teachings of Judaism, in 2 volumes actually, and one day I hope to write a third, a code of Jewish ethics. Just what does Judaism have to say about ethical issues? I wanted it accessible to Jews, and I wanted it as a work accessible, to non-Jews as well. It's very hard though. How do you organize a code? You have to have certain, you don't want the book to just become a mishmash of every ethical teaching that was ever offered in the Bible or in the Talmud. There has to be some sense of order. So you're guided by a philosophy. Part of my guiding philosophy was Judaism's insistence on the significance of free will. So you'll say, what's the big chiddush? What's the big new insight? Doesn't everybody believe in free will? And the answer is no. Think about it for a moment. If you remove God from the picture, and you believe that all that exists in the world is the physical, not the metaphysical, only the physical, so what then become the determinants of human behavior? And usually people point to 2 things, heredity and environment. If everything is physical, so why do you act in a certain way? Because of your heredity and your environment. I once saw a cartoon showing a young boy, must have been about 10, looking at his report card filled with D's and F's, and standing over his shoulder is a scowling father. And the kid says, what do you think it is, Dad, heredity or environment? Probably the most famous criminal defense lawyer in American history was Clarence Darrow. Darrow was also arguably America's most famous religious skeptic. He was not a believer. Darrow opposed, which is obviously not surprising, he was a criminal defense lawyer, he opposed capital punishment. What's less widely known about Darrow is that he opposed all punishment. Exactly for the reason that I just said. Speaking of jails, he said, all people are the products of 2 things and 2 things only, heredity and environment. They're, oh yeah, here it is. I want to read it so I read it exactly as he said it. All people are products of 2 things and 2 things only, their heredity and environment. They act in exact accord with the heredity with which they took from the past, and for which they are in no wise responsible, and from the environment we all act from the same way. Judaism insists that in addition to heredity and environment, human beings have a soul. And that soul helps explain the fact that two people can come from the same background, have the same genetic input, be raised in the same environment, and come out very differently. So in other words, Judaism insists on free will. Indeed, it is the sine qua non. Without free will, the whole Torah makes no sense. The whole books of the whole Bible, the prophets, make no sense. What is the point of telling people to act differently if it's not within their capacity to act differently? So in other words, Judaism stands or falls on the issue of free will. It might help account for an unhappy fact, why God doesn't always intervene when we would like him to intervene in the face of evil, because without free will, human beings seem to stop being human beings in the way the Bible defines them, as creatures created in the image of God, who like God know good from evil, and who have the free will to do that which they want. So this becomes very critical. Now I want to make it clear what I am saying and what I'm not saying. I'm saying that human beings have free will. I'm not saying we have free will in all spheres. We have free will in moral areas. We don't have free will in all areas of life. I knew in high school that if I spent the rest of my life and devoted 8 hours a day to the study of chemistry, the world of chemistry would not thereby profit. Because you know, at a certain point, no matter what I would do, I'll give you another example. How many people here, showing of hands, how many people here at some point in your life have been joggers? How many of you were able to run at your best 8-minute miles? How many 7-minute miles? How many 6-minute miles? Speaking to a Jewish audience. Okay. I'll tell you about a funny experience I once had. I was once giving a version of some of the comments I'm talking about here tonight to an audience, and with me that day, because he was speaking about a different thing, was Eric Kandel. Eric had won the Nobel Prize in 2000 in the field of medicine, and he had published a book dealing with issues of memory. And I got up to speak. He was in the audience. I was speaking first, and it was a very sharply angled podium, and every time I put my notes down, they'd fall off the podium. I'm a total klutz, but Eric came up and adjusted the podium very quickly, and I laughed. I said, well, I suppose you have to, I would not think you have to be a Nobel Prize winner to be able to do that. Anyway, a little later on in the speech, I started asking that question, 8-minute miles, 7. His hand stays up. It turns out he had gone to Erasmus Hall High School, and he had been on the track team, and had run a mile in 4 minutes and 53 seconds. And I looked at him, and I said, Eric, genug, enough. Is your whole purpose in life to make everybody else here feel inadequate? It's not enough that you won the Nobel Prize, you ran a 4-minute and 53-second mile. So the truth is, free will is limited. You don't have it in every sphere. Having said that, the rabbis have a stunning insight. And it occurred to me one day, because I haven't seen it commented on, where they expanded free will in an interesting way. If one can be said to have a favorite teaching in the Mishnah, my favorite teaching is the first Mishnah in the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, where Rabbi Ben Zoma teaches, Ezehu Chacham, who is a Chacham, who is a wise person? Halovei Mikol Adam, one who learns from everybody. This is an interesting observation. Normally we would think, who's a wise man? So we'd think, number one, you probably have to be born l'chatchila. To begin with, you have to have a high IQ. Secondly, you probably have to have studied at many important institutions. The rabbis don't answer that. They said, no, everybody has the capacity to become wise if you're willing to learn from everybody. And conversely, even if you are very smart, but you only are teaching and you're never willing to learn from others, you're not going to be so wise one of these days. So in other words, they take a trait of wisdom that normally we would think is restricted to a very small percentage of the population, and suddenly they make it possible for many, many people to have that trait. Then they say, Ezehu Gibor, who is a strong person. Originally in Hebrew, Gibor meant a strong person. In modern Hebrew, it also is used to mean a hero. So who is a hero? Who is a strong person? Hakoveshet Yitzro, one who overcomes his inclinations. And the impression is they mean the evil inclination. Again, normally we associate heroism with physical bravado. You know, we hear that somebody's a hero, so we think of great physical feats. I remember my daughter Naomi, who's now in her mid-20s, told me that when she was 5 or 4, she thought I was the bravest man in the world. A belief that was shattered when she was 6, and we went to an amusement park and I wouldn't go on the roller coaster. But the rabbis understood, if you restrict heroism to acts of extraordinary bravery, you run into 2 problems. Number 1, a lot of people are not physically brave. And number 2, even people who are physically brave are relatively rarely called upon to exert that, to exercise that virtue. Now it's true, when physical bravery is required, it could be life transformative, it can be life saving, it is very important. But what they said, one who overcomes his evil inclinations, that's going on all of the time. And if you define heroism in that way, it means heroism suddenly becomes accessible to people who normally wouldn't be able to reach the heights of heroism, either because of limitations or because of lack of opportunities. So suddenly they take a trait that again is restricted to a small percentage of people and make it accessible to everyone. And then of course, Ezehu Ashir, who is rich, Hasameach B'chalko. By the way, it's also often translated as one who is satisfied with what he has, but literally the Hebrew means one who is happy with what he has. As regards satisfied with what he has, have you ever met any Jew who's satisfied with what he has? And I don't know if it's even that desirable, but can you be happy even when you don't have all that you want? I'll tell you about an experience from my own life. I've helped a man in some of his writings who's a very wealthy person. You know, one of the people on the famous Forbes listing. And over the years, you know, we've been quite close. So I asked him the sort of question that one normally will not ask a very wealthy person. I said to him, what is it like to never have to worry about money? And this man has in the area of $2 billion. So he said, I'm not so rich. Sheldon Adelson, he's rich. Okay. I'm not kidding you. About 3 weeks later, on the front page of the business section of the Times, there was a headlined article, Sheldon Adelson, number 3 is not enough. It turned out that in the Forbes listing that year, Adelson was number 3, behind Buffett and Gates, behind Gates and Buffett. And the whole article was about how Sheldon Adelson was determined that he was going to surpass Gates and Buffett. And it really reminded me then of this teaching, one who is happy with what he has. In other words, if the purpose of wealth is to have enough money that you don't have to think about money, well then if you're still thinking about money a lot, then you're really not all that wealthy. So it suddenly makes wealth possible even, now again, I'm not saying I don't think in those terms also, that I always, think about I need more, but at least what the rabbis are doing, normally we would say who is wealthy, and we'd think, let's say it is that Forbes listing of 400, so then it's like almost 1 out of 800,000 Americans. But suddenly they make it accessible again to everyone. So that's what the rabbis set out to do. In writing on my code, I decided to look at a number of traits and see what were distinctive Jewish teachings that these traits were making apparent to us. And I did my research in the old-fashioned way, like I was a kid back in high school or college before the age of computers. I started going through the Jewish sources. I'd look at the Jewish sources starting from the Bible, which means the Torah, and then the later books of the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, medieval Jewish thought, modern Jewish thought, and because I was dealing with a variety of ethical issues, I looked into non-Jewish thinkers as well to see if there were additional things that could be added on. One of the topics I was looking at was the virtue of forgiveness. The book, I think I deal with 22 different virtues. And when I had gathered about 150, 200 note cards, I decided to start organizing them. And it became apparent to me that there are 3 attitudes towards forgiveness in the Jewish tradition. Times when forgiveness is required, times when forgiveness is optional, and if there was an innovative feature in Judaism, it was times when forgiveness is forbidden. When is forgiveness required? In the large majority of instances. If somebody has harmed you, and the harm that he or she has inflicted upon you is not irrevocable, and the person asks you for forgiveness, you are obligated to forgive them. But what if you really have been hurt and you don't feel ready to forgive them? Then you have to struggle with yourself. The person is obligated to ask you up to 3 times. If you refuse all 3 times, and it can't be one after another, do you forgive me? No. Do you forgive me? No. It has to be some time, but you're put on notice, and you have to deal with it. And Maimonides rules that if even after 3 requests you refuse to forgive, you become an achzari. You become cruel by doing that. So again, if somebody has hurt you, and the hurt was not an irrevocable one, and they sincerely request forgiveness, you're obligated to forgive them. When, therefore, is forgiveness optional? In 2 instances. Number 1, if the hurt has been irrevocable, or number 1, if the person doesn't ask you for forgiveness. And then, if the hurt really is irrevocable. What's an example of an irrevocable hurt? We can all think of some. The Talmudic example that's given is where somebody slanders your good name. Because the rabbis understood if your good name is slandered, even if the person regrets what they said, they're not going to reach everybody they told. And even if they do, the people they told are not going to reach everybody that they told. So you can never fully undo the damage. And there are many instances where people don't ask us for forgiveness. So what should we do then? Well, there are times that one should still find ways to forgive. I heard remarkable insights about this about 2 rabbis that I know, both of whom are actually good friends. One is Abraham Twersky, who I mentioned earlier, and one is Harold Kushner. Twersky is a psychiatrist. He's really one of the golden figures of the modern Jewish world. He's written more than 60 books. As he always puts it, he said, I've written one book 60 times on the importance of self-esteem. But he really has written about a lot more than that. But Twersky became a psychiatrist. He comes from the well-known Twersky Hasidic dynasty. He became a psychiatrist and in the early 60s, and his area of expertise is addictive behavior. And addictive behavior in the early 60s overwhelmingly meant alcoholism. By the late 60s, it started to refer, of course, also to drug addictions. And today, addictive behavior is used to encompass a whole series of self-destructive types of behavior. But Twersky's particular expertise has always remained alcoholism. And he told me of an incident. He was dealing with a recovering alcoholic. And recovering alcoholics, struggle with this every day. That's why apparently at AA meetings, Alcoholic Anonymous meetings, people will often get up and say, my name is John, I'm an alcoholic, and I have now gone 806 days without a drink. It's really a day-by-day struggle. What's the main problem that confronts recovering alcoholics? How do they resist that first drink? Because obviously the problem of alcoholics is that they can't resist. Once they start drinking, they then will not be able to resist the second and the third and the fourth drink. So Twersky was speaking with a recovering alcoholic who said what he had to learn was what was most likely to make him turn to drink. And he said it was when he was angry at someone. He said when he was angry at someone, he'd just be thinking about it. And it would be getting him more and more upset. And to calm down, he'd take a drink. And then, of course, the whole process would start. And the man said something so profound to Twersky that it applies to every one of us in this room, whether you have an issue with drinking or not. He said, I learned I had to stop carrying around grudges. Carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. That is such a profound insight that I want to repeat it. Carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. I know if I'm angry at somebody, really angry, really upset, it could be in any setting. It could be a fight you've had in your family. It could be a fight with somebody else. You don't get your most productive work done that day, I can assure you of that. It's destructive. Sometimes you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and then you're upset about something, you can't fall back asleep. So he said I had to learn how to control those grudges. So sometimes it's worth learning how to forgive because you're paying a price, which was the point of the story that Harold Kushner told me. There was a woman in his congregation whose husband had left her, in a very mean-spirited, ugly way, ran off with another woman, then reached a divorce settlement, and then didn't stay in proper contact with his children. I mean, this woman had a right to be angry, and she was. What bothered Kushner, though, was that 10 years later, her rage was unabated. And he said to the woman, for 10 years, you've been walking around with a hot coal in your hand, ready to throw it at your ex-husband, and all you've done is burn a hole in your hand. So there are times when it's within our interests to learn how to forgive. By the way, it's very interesting. How many of you, if I may ask, say the Shema before you go to sleep at night? Okay, a lot of people. Now, a lot of people I know say the Shema, literally say the Shema. You know, they either say the first line or they say the first paragraph. As you might have learned, you're members of an Orthodox school, so as you might well know, the Jewish siddur is not, what is the expression when if you ever add on something you have to subtract? It's not a zero-sum base, or whatever it is. It's not like when they add on a prayer, they take away another prayer. So that the siddur grows and grows. The art scroll, Shema al Hamitad, is now 8 pages. That's okay, by the time you finish it, you really will have fallen asleep. Well, one of the prayers in it is a very beautiful prayer. Hareini mocha, I hereby forgive. And then you list a whole host of people that they want you to go to bed at night having forgiven people. I hereby anybody who insulted me, anybody who did this, anybody who did that. By the way, it clearly was a Kabbalistic prayer because a lot of people, how many of you say that prayer? How many of you are familiar with it? Right. I don't know if you've ever noticed, there's a very interesting thing in that prayer. In the middle of it, it says, that you forgive anyone who hurt you, bein begilgul zeh, bein begilgul acher, whether they hurt you in this lifetime or in a previous incarnation. That, you know, so it's obviously a belief in reincarnation, and therefore clearly, you know, it was a Kabbalistic prayer because most of the belief in reincarnation in Judaism came through the Gilgal prayer, through that. My wife, whenever she's heard me speak on this, always tells me to emphasize, even though if you do forgive somebody, it's smart to go at some point and tell the person that they hurt you. Because she said, it's hard to be fully forgiving if you never make it known. And she said what's happened in her own lifetime is, on a number of occasions when she went over to the person who had hurt her, the person obviously was clearly not aware of how much hurt they had inflicted on her. And so therefore, if you want to have a full repair, it's probably wise to do that. And often then they really could feel closer. And then there are times when Judaism says forgiveness is forbidden. And when is that? You can't forgive something done against another person. So you'll say, what's the chiddush there? What's the new insight there? And the new insight there is a profound one because this is one of the areas where Jewish teachings often diverge from much of contemporary Christian thinking, in which it is considered meritorious to always forgive. There have been ridiculous, okay, I shouldn't, it's clear what I think of that attitude, but okay, there have been instances where shootings took place at high school, and the next day you'll see Christian kids, you know, who are good kids, not bad people, God forbid, that they'll hang out signs, we forgive you, John, or whatever. You know, how can they forgive? The person who's dead is the only one who would have, even parents don't have the right to forgive the murder of their child. All that they can forgive is the pain that they've suffered, but they can't forgive on behalf of their child. So I'll give you an example, 2 examples of what I mean. I'll start with the Reverend John Miller. Now you'll say, why am I picking on the Reverend John Miller of Martha's Vineyard, since nobody here knows who John Miller is. He's a Methodist minister who had an unusual experience in 1997. He found out that on the upcoming Sunday, President Bill Clinton was going to be in his church service. Obviously, the Secret Service had to come to his church to check it out and make sure everything was safe for the president. So Miller had an opportunity granted to very few clergymen, rabbis, priests, or ministers. He knew that the President of the United States was going to be sitting in his, I was going to say in his shul, he was going to be sitting at his service that week. And I am sure that when he wrote his sermon, he knew, I was about to say, he knew he had one shot at the president. He knew he had one opportunity to reach the president. So we can imagine that Miller spent a lot of time figuring out what he wanted to speak about and what he wanted to say, and guess what? he wanted to speak about the theme of forgiveness. And then in the middle of his sermon, on this his opportunity to reach the president, he held up a very large photograph of Timothy McVeigh, the man who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, in which 168 people were killed, among them 24 children, and he said to his congregation, I invite you to look at Timothy McVeigh and forgive him. I have forgiven him. I ask you to forgive him. We as Christians are asked to do so. A similar sort of comment was made on September 11th, 2002 by Pope John Paul II. Before I read to you what the Pope said, I want to first say something else, because I had a very, very high regard for Pope John Paul II for a number of reasons. As a Jew, I had a real sense of hakaras hatov, recognition of good. He's the Pope who established diplomatic relations with Israel. He went to a synagogue in Rome to pray. He prayed at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, and asked forgiveness for things the Christian church had done. And there's another story I want to share you, because this story is not a well-known story. I learned it from Yafa Eliach, who wrote a book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, in which Yafa, who's a PhD in history, was a very careful scholar, so she got her details right. And she tells in her book the story of a Jewish family in Poland in '42. And it's clear what the Nazis are doing. The Jews are being deported. They're never heard from again. And this family had no place to run. It's not like there was a lot of sympathy for the Jews among the partisans, but they wanted to save their 2-year-old son. And there was a Catholic family that they were close with, and they brought their son to that family, and they asked them if they would, and this was a childless couple, if they would raise their child. And they left with this couple the address of 2 of their family members, 2 families that they were related to, one in Montreal and one in Washington, D.C. And they say, after the war, you'll return our child to us, but if we don't come back, please write to these families. The Catholic couple undertook to take care of the child, and they put their own lives at risk, because everyone in their town knew that they were childless, so they had to flee, and they raised the boy as a Catholic. They were pious Catholics. World War II ends, and by early 1946, the parents have not come. They are by now in love with the child, and they go to their local parish priest, and they ask him to baptize the child and formalize their adoption. The priest questions them carefully and says, tell me exactly what the parents said to you. And they're honest. And they tell the priest, the parents asked us to be in touch with the families in Montreal, with the family in Washington. So the priest said to them, write to those 2 families. If either of them wants to adopt the child, we'll all carry out the baptism, we'll formalize the adoption. They write, both families want the child. For immigration reasons, the child's able to first get into Montreal. A year later goes to Washington, because that family was even closer with the people who were murdered. And they always stay in touch with the Catholic couple, very grateful to them. They are poor people. The family in America and in Canada, they send money to them. Over the years, the man dies. They stay in touch with the woman. And then in 1978, she writes, and for the first time tells them the story of how she wanted to baptize him. And she says, why am I telling you that story now? Because yesterday that parish priest became Pope John Paul II. Okay. Now I feel I can say something critical. I did not want to say anything not nice before I told you that story, because I think he was a great figure, an historic figure. He played a major role in bringing about the fall of communism. September 11th, 2002, the Pope's prayer. We pray for the victims today. May they rest in peace, and may God show mercy and forgiveness for the authors of this terrible attack. Why mercy and forgiveness? The only regret the authors of this terrible attack had probably was that they didn't strike an hour later. They struck at 8:45, just before rush hour, just before the workday normally begins. They would have killed far more people. Okay, so in summation, what do we look? We look at 3 attitudes in Judaism on forgiveness. There are times when it is obligatory, and that's the large majority of the time. Someone hurts you, the hurt is not irrevocable. Ask for forgiveness, you should forgive. If you have struggles doing so, tell them to come back and ask it another time and work on yourself. There are times when it is optional. If the person doesn't ask for forgiveness or if the person has done you irrevocable harm. But there too, as we learned from that story with Tversky and with Kushner, there are times when it's worth it even for our sakes to find a way to forgive. Remember that great insight of the recovering alcoholic to Rabbi Tversky: carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. And finally, there are times when it really is forbidden. And what people have to learn in advance is there are certain acts which, if you do them, and they're very few in number, they do put you beyond the possibility of forgiveness. Just know that. It doesn't mean there aren't things you can try and do, but you can never go back to the state you were in before you committed that act. I want to speak for a few minutes on another topic, and that is the issue of humility and self-esteem. Is humility an important virtue in Judaism? Extremely important. You know what indicates that? If I ask people to call out what were some of the attributes of Moses, okay, we know he was courageous. He stepped forward when he saw a Jewish slave being beaten, and he stopped him. We know that Moses hated injustice when he saw the women shepherds of Midian being mistreated by the male shepherds of Midian. He steps forward and stands up on their behalf. He was compassionate. The way he prays for his sister, even though she had just spoken ill of him, but he was so concerned. El Narafanawa, oh God, please heal her. But the Torah never says to us Moses was courageous, Moses stood up for justice, Moses was compassionate. We infer that from these stories. The only virtue the Torah actually attributes to Moshe is Vayish Moshe. Now this man Moshe was very humble. So what exactly does humility mean? Well, it means you don't think you're worth more than other people, even if you're more accomplished than them. You're more worthy of respect or other things. If you're humble, you know what your strengths are, but you also know that you therefore might have concomitantly, greater obligations. Self-esteem becomes very critical, and I'll tell you how I understand it. The most famous verse in the Torah, I mentioned earlier, is of course, love your neighbor as yourself. So what's the explicit command? Love your neighbor. What's the implicit command? Love yourself. I wonder if there's been an abusive parent in history who had a really good self-image. And we know, you want to go to people, when you were a kid, you got in trouble and you had to speak to your parents, you were in trouble in school. Did you want to come home and find that they were in good moods, or would you prefer to come home that they were in really crappy moods about their own lives? Another thing. People are nicer, as a rule, when they are feeling good. There's a wonderful story they tell about the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim is this great rabbinic sage who lived a very long life. He lived from 1838 to 1933. The Chafetz Chaim lived during the last period in history when it was possible to be famous without being widely recognized. Because in his early life, he already started publishing Sfarim. His most famous, not his most famous, but his first book was a book called Chafetz Chaim, Against the Laws of Lashon Hara, about speaking badly or unfairly of others. So he writes the book, I think it was in the early 1870s, and at that time, what do I mean when I say it was possible to be famous without being recognized? The camera was already coming into fruition in the 1850s. All of us have seen pictures from the Civil War, pictures of Lincoln, but it was less commonly used in Eastern Europe, and it was very uncommonly used among Orthodox Jews, some of whom questioned whether it was appropriate to allow photographs. So the Chafetz Chaim was going from town to town speaking about his book, and he's on a train, and seated near him on a train is a man who's clearly also a religious Jew, so they start speaking, and Chafetz Chaim says, "Where are you going?" He says, "Oh, I'm going into town to hear the Chafetz Chaim speak. He's the greatest tzaddik, the greatest saint, and the greatest Talmid Chacham, and the greatest scholar in the Jewish world today." The Chafetz Chaim was a little uncomfortable at being described in such grandiose terms. He said, "I happen to know the Chafetz Chaim. He's not such a scholar. He's not such a saint." Speaking so disrespectfully of the Chafetz Chaim that he slaps him. The train arrives in the town. That night, the man goes to the speech. And he sees, to his utter mortification, that the man who's giving the speech is the guy he slapped. So he goes over and he says to him, Rabbi, I had no idea it was you. Please forgive me. The Chafetz Chaim says, I have nothing to forgive you for. It was my honor you were defending. He said, on the contrary, I owe you a debt of gratitude. I've been going around for years speaking and teaching people not to speak fairly, badly of others. You've told me that it's also wrong to speak badly of yourself. So in other words, we have to have a sense of esteem. If you want to see a model for appropriate self-esteem, look at the opening chapter of Gracious, where in the first chapter of Genesis, it says 6 times a certain phrase, Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. In other words, God took nachas in his creation. I remember I was working out many years ago at BCI, the Brandeis Camp Institute here, and there was a young man who came out there as to participate in the program. He was about 19 years old at the time, and he was extraordinary. He would do really extraordinary things. But I noticed whenever people would compliment him, yeah, it's nothing, he'd always sort of disparage it. I said, why are you doing that? I said, first of all, it's not nice. Somebody offers you a compliment, you throw it back in your face. Secondly, you really did do good work. People will just think that you're being falsely humble. So he said, so what am I supposed to say when someone compliments me? I said, say thank you, that's very kind. And the truth of the matter is, we have to be able to appreciate what we're good, because people who are overly self-critical, a terrible thing happens. When they mess up, they are understandably unhappy. But if they can't have real joy and sense of appreciation when they've done well, so they're always lose. It's a lose-lose game. And people need to be able to have that sense of pleasure. So you have to be able to have an appropriate self-esteem. Self-esteem doesn't mean feeling badly about yourself. You know, there was one of Churchill's political opponents. Somebody, Churchill was often critical of this man. Somebody said to Churchill, well, won't you at least acknowledge he's modest? And he says, yeah, he is modest. He has a lot to be modest about. Yerucham Lvovich, who was a Musar teacher at the Mir Yeshiva, had a wonderful insight. He said, it's very important for a person to know his or her weaknesses. And he's right. The older I get, the more I find that the people I least enjoy dealing with are people who don't recognize their own weaknesses. Because the sort of people who don't know their own weaknesses can get very defensive. You can't say anything to them. Not knowing your own weaknesses can account for the unusual thing that you could meet a 70-year-old person who's still immature. Because if a person doesn't know himself or herself, that's a sign of immaturity. Having said that, though, what Lvovich said was, but it's even more important to know your strengths. Because those strengths are what are ultimately going to enable you to overcome your weaknesses. A person can become paralyzed when they're too aware all the time of their weaknesses. Parents often make this error. They'll go to a parent-teacher night, and they'll get 7 good reports and 1 bad report. And suddenly, what's the most important subject? Whatever they got the bad report in. Obviously, if a child at a certain age is not good at something, he has to be good enough to be able to pass. But that's probably, as my parents know, if they spoke to my chemistry teacher, they did not come home with a happy report. But I think we were all sort of in agreement that's not going to be the major subject in the rest of my life. Common in American schools, a kid who's very good at the basketball team but does badly in school, so they penalize him because his grades were too low, so he cannot be on the basketball team. That's very smart. You take away the one thing the person's proud of, and that's going to make the person get better. You need to find a way to build up the person's self-esteem. Now again, self-esteem ultimately, and this is important, because you want self-esteem also rooted in a moral sensibility. If there's one change I could bring into American society, for both the sake of America and for the sake of the Jews in America, it would be that parents should reserve the highest praise of their children for when their children do kind acts. Children generally get their highest praise for one of 4 things. For their intellectual, academic achievements, for their athletic accomplishments, for their cultural achievements, piano or whatever, and in the case of girls, for their looks. A child who gets his or her compliments is happy to get them. But what about the child, but even among the children who get those compliments, there's always the feeling that parental love is to some extent dependent on their performing in those areas. And what about the child who only hears, oh, but so-and-so is really a good kid, from which it becomes apparent that being a good kid is not such a big deal. If parents would reserve the highest praise of their children when their children did kind acts, we would raise a generation of people who feel most good about themselves when they're doing kind acts. They would associate doing kindness to others with a feeling of being loved. But that's why it's important. So we want to root self-esteem in that, but also make it possible for people to focus on their strengths, because those are going to play such a critical role as they develop. And that's why I'm convinced it says, love your neighbor as yourself, because the Torah is hinting to us in a very strong hint that if you love yourself, you will be so much better able to love others. And that's why it's critical. So if you're offered a position, let's say they want you to join the board of the synagogue, and your instinct is to say no, ask yourself, why are you saying no? Is it because you really thought it through and you really don't have the requisite skills? Or if you have the requisite skills, is it something else? And Rabbi Tversky says that's how you know to distinguish low self-esteem and humility. Humility says, what would God want me to do in this circumstance? Low self-esteem just discourages you from doing anything. And so you have to be humble, because low self-esteem is not a virtue. It's actually a bad thing, because it stops you from doing good things that you could do for others. So these are just, two perspectives. Okay, one other that I deal with. Why is it so difficult for people to change and make changes in their behavior? I'll just offer a couple of suggestions. I touch on quite a number in the book, but I'll just offer a few. One of the things is human beings have a natural tendency to blame others, and that's how the Bible begins. Eve eats from the tree of knowledge and gives it to Adam to eat. God says, why did you eat of the tree? Adam says it was Eve's fault. Eve blames it on the snake. There's a common tendency to blame it on others. There was a young woman I knew when she was an adolescent, was getting in trouble a lot, and she always blamed it on other people. He got me into this, she got me into this. And I said to her once, I said, I'm actually very pessimistic about your future. You're the most unlucky person I've ever met. You always fall you always fall in with a bad crowd. I said, ironically, if you would accept responsibility for what you did, I would actually be optimistic about your future. Because if you can cause a problem, you can uncause a problem. So that's why it's so important for people to be able to take responsibility. Jonathan Sachs, who I know has spoken here, the immediate, of course, past Chief Rabbi of England, recounts a conversation he had. He met the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was 21. And in the course of speaking with the Rebbe, he said at one point, I recently found myself in a situation, and the Rebbe said, don't use that expression. Say, I placed myself in a situation, because if you place yourself in one situation, you can place yourself in another situation. In other words, there's a desire for people not to see themselves in passive terms. When you see yourself in passive terms, you're incapable then of defining and transforming a situation. So that's why it's important not to blame others. Even if others play a role in it, think primarily of the role you played and what can you learn for the future. Another thing is, Ernst Simon, once a professor of education at Hebrew University, he was part of the inner circle of Martin Buber, but Buber's crowd as a rule did not become traditionally observant Jews, but Simon did. And he said he was always puzzled by one of the al-Chaitz, one of the sins for which we hit against our heart, and it was for sins we committed against God either willingly or bonus, under compulsion. Now, it's a known fact that if you do an act under compulsion, you're not responsible. He said, so what does it mean, bonus? And he said it means we said it was under compulsion, but it wasn't. We said I was forced to do that. I was forced by circumstances to be dishonest in something that I did. I was forced, I couldn't control my temper or something. He said, well, we could have. He said, so that's why it says, bonus. If you're saying you were forced, the classic example of it is in the Torah. Right around where we are, with a famous story. What does Aaron say? Moses is very upset. He finds out about the golden calf. And then he comes down and finds out that, lo and behold, the person involved in building it was Aaron. And what does Aaron say? How does he defend himself? He said, they forced me to do it, and I took all the gold and I threw it, now tame this calf. And the dog ate my homework. No, I mean, it was, it was Me'ones. Again, I'm not trying to say, listen, Aaron is one of the great heroes of the Jewish tradition. Aaron is the one on whom, we base, who loves people and brings them with Karvan Torah. But in that case, he was put on the spot by Moses. And Moses was, upset with him because we often do that. It's a natural tendency. When we've done something wrong, our natural tendency, if we can't evade responsibilities, to say it was a mistake or we were forced, and it is hard to do, but that's what they're asking. A third is where we confuse good and evil. This is the hardest to repent of, because people do evil things. There's an amazing, let's see if I can find this quickly. As bad as anything that happened in American history was John Wilkes Booth's assassination of Lincoln, which had a terrible effect in many ways. It was awful for the black people, it was awful for Southern relations with others. And who committed this act? John Wilkes Booth, of course. And, he was then killed. It was an 11-day search, and he was then shot. But he left a note behind. They found notes that he had written. He had written a diary during the days he was fleeing. And look how he sees himself. After being hunted like a dog through swamps and being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against him, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for it made Tell a hero. And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, and looked upon as a common cutthroat. My action was purer than theirs. That's a person who puts himself beyond the possibility of repentance. I mean, first of all, murder, you can't repent, really. But it's when people, oi, what does Isaiah say? Oi for those who call light darkness and darkness light. I'll give you a classic example of it, because it's going on right now. What were the last words heard by the approximately 300 people who died on the 4 planes that were crashed on 9/11? The words probably were Allahu Akbar, God is great. At the very moment people are doing the most evil act of which a human being is capable, the murderers are calling out God is great. An act which brings God into disrepute, which my friend Dennis Prager has argued that the Islamist terrorism is probably one of the causes of the growth in recent years of atheism, because it's brought such disrepute onto religion. So again, these are just 3 of the things that play a role in making it hard to change. I list others, but one is blaming others, and that is so hard to overcome. Believe me, I know it from my own experience, it's hard. One is to say I was forced when, if we want to be a little more honest with ourselves, we probably weren't forced. We could have, resisted, or calling an evil act good evil, maybe that, God willing, maybe we don't do that, but these are just examples of it. Just give you one example briefly of another subject I touch on in the book. How many people here wish they had better control over their tempers? Okay, now I'm going to ask the question in a way that I'll get an honest answer. How many people here are seated next to someone who they wish had better control? I saw one person on both sides hands when I want to just give you one suggestion that occurred to me based on my own life experiences, and that is, no matter how angry you get at another person, restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. In other words, if somebody really has done something that you think is wrong, you have a right to express your anger, but only speak about what they did. Don't start in within the context. You did 5 years ago. You did this. You did that. First of all, when you attack someone like that, of course they're going to get defensive. And if you can't control what you're going to say, then don't say it, because no good's going to come of it. But if you can restrict your expression of your anger to that incident, that can immediately, even if you have a bad temper, you will never again say something so hurtful and angry that it will cause a permanent rupture or a permanent pain. Have I in my own life ever violated that rule? Yes. And I want to tell you, without exception, every single time, and it's not common, but every single time I violated it, I regretted doing so. So I just wanted to look at, this evening through the prism of Jewish teachings on what effect they could have. About 200 years ago, in 1810, one of the great early Hasidic masters, Nachman of Bratslav, died. And one of Nachman's teachings was, if you're not going to be a better person tomorrow than you were today, what need do you have for tomorrow? I once concluded a speech with that thought, and somebody said, Joseph, that's a real downer way to end your speech. So I want to rephrase for Nachman. I wish all of you a very good today and an even better tomorrow. Thank you. Okay, I'll tell you a little about the book, because I know that often some people wanted me to sign different books, but also the Rabbi book, and I'll be happy to stay afterwards and to sign. How many of you at some point in your life have been approached by a Chabad chassid? Okay, let me ask the question differently. How many of you have never been approached by a Chabad? Okay. So this movement had a very dramatic impact, and it all goes back to Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Rebbe. I recently published a book I worked on longer than any of my books, and I've written, I believe, 18 books. I worked on it for 5 solid years, researching and writing it. When Menachem Mendel Schneerson became Rebbe in 1951, he set himself a goal that he really wanted to try to reach all the Jews in the world. And I'm convinced that he was influenced by the experience of the Holocaust. As Jonathan Sachs put it, if the Nazis hunted down every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wanted to search out every Jew in love. There are now Chabad houses in 49 of the 50 states and in over 80 countries. If you know the answer to this question, don't say it. If you don't know the answer, guess. Which is the one state that doesn't have a Chabad house? Anybody want to take a guess? Alaska. Alaska has an active Chabad house. I spoke to 200 people in Anchorage in early September. No, mid-September. Hawaii. Somebody guess Hawaii. No, please. Okay, somebody, one person at a time. Okay, somebody guessed Hawaii. Wait, can I want to say something. Let me ask you a question. If you were a Chabad shliach and you were given a list of 50 American states, do you really think Hawaii would be the one state? No, never. Wyoming doesn't even have a Chabad house. Somebody else guessed Montana. I spoke to the Chabad rabbi in Montana, Rabbi Brook, who's trying to get every Jewish house in Montana to put up a mezuzah. He had recently, around the time we were speaking, he had recently gone to a city in Montana that sounds like a shtetl. It's a real city in Montana called Whitefish. Okay, somebody, any other guesses? New York, yeah. No, who said North Dakota? You're close as you can be. South Dakota doesn't, so I want all of you to know there are naming opportunities. South Dakota. That'll be the 50th. The 40th, the 49th, by the way, was Mississippi. The Rebbe influenced circles that you would not expect. I've been sent pictures of people holding my book that they've been reading. One of them came to me showing John Lewis. Now, John Lewis is the congressman, a very liberal Democratic congressman who was part of Martin Luther King's inner circle. Lewis co-sponsored the resolution in 1994 to give the Rebbe a Congressional Gold Medal. His co-sponsor on the resolution was Newt Gingrich. As Lewis said at the time, this is the only issue on which Newt Gingrich and I have ever agreed. So we see that we're dealing with an unusual figure who goes beyond the normal stereotype of what we'd expect. One of the things I came across early on, now I forgot her name. In 1968, she was elected as the first black woman who was elected to Congress. Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm gets elected to Congress in '68. She represents Bedford-Stuyvesant, a poor black area in Brooklyn, and she also represents parts of Crown Heights. She arrives in Congress in '68. It's only 4 years after the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Bill, and Congress is still largely controlled by the House is controlled by Southern Democrats, many of whom were racists. So how do they get their revenge on Shirley Chisholm? They put her on the Agriculture Committee, leaving one New York newspaper to headline the appointment, "A tree grows in Brooklyn." Chisholm, was very upset. She gets a call from Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's top aide, the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, one of your constituents, would like to meet with you. She comes to meet with the Rebbe. She knew who the Rebbe was because when she was campaigning, she had paid a visit. Almost all New York and all national politicians would visit the Rebbe. He would be affable to everybody. Obviously, he would not start going around endorsing candidates. He says to Chisholm, "I understand you're very upset." She says, "I'm insulted." And she really, because she said, "I wanted to do work in labor, I wanted to do work in education." The Rebbe said, "What an opportunity God has given you. You know how many poor people there are in America who don't have enough food? And how the Agriculture Committee can deal with excesses in food?" She arrives in Congress. She starts working with Bob Dole, who had recently become a Republican senator from Kansas. They expand food stamps. She helps create the WICS program, Women, Infant, and Children in Need. And the whole story was not known until a breakfast in 1983, a retirement breakfast for her in Congress, where she tells the story of her encounter with the Rebbe. And she said, "What I learned from that rabbi in Brooklyn is that what we think is a challenge from God might actually be a real opportunity for us." And she said that, and if poor children now have more food than they have, it's because that rabbi in Crown Heights had vision. So right away we know we're dealing with a different sort of figure. But part of what made the Rebbe so special was, I delineate in the book 7 virtues, I call 7 virtues of the Rebbe. And I really developed them because I think these have been factors that are, in a sense, the Rebbe's Torah Shebaal Peh, his oral law, that these have helped Chabad Shluchim to expand the movement since his death. I'll give you an example. We all were raised with the expression, anything worth doing is worth doing well. The Rebbe's attitude was, anything worth doing is worth doing now. And I show what that means. He would not delay things the way most of us would delay things. He would act irrationally to make things happen now. Or a whole chapter on how to disagree without being disagreeable. He would never attack people by name. Michal Seligson, who compiled a 1,600-page index to all of the Rebbe's speeches, said he does not recall an instance in which the Rebbe attacked someone by name. And I give examples after examples of people who he had attacked. He said, "I don't speak about people, I speak about shitot. I don't speak about people, I speak about approaches." And because he refrained from attacking people by name, he could work closely with people whose shitot, whose approaches he really had attacked, because he'd find a cause on which they could work together. When a rabbi wrote him a sharp letter about an area of disagreement, the Rebbe said, "That's true, we have a disagreement, and there are 612 areas in which we agree." So it was a whole different way of looking at things. But one of his things was his belief in the supremacy of the commandment of love. Now, I spoke earlier of how Hillel and Akiva put love as a central emphasis. But the truth is, that's not how it was normally treated in Jewish life. The Talmud goes so far as to say that the reason the Second Temple was destroyed was because of sinat chinam, because of causeless hatred in the Jewish community. I'll give you an example of what that can lead to. One of the tragic events in medieval Jewish history, in which there were unfortunately many tragic events, was the burning of the Talmud in France in 1240, instigated by the French Inquisition. Now, the burning of the Talmud at any time in Jewish history would be a catastrophe. But in the medieval world, it was even more catastrophic because this was before the printing press. So 24 wagon loads of Talmuds were burned, every one of them a volume that somebody had written by hand. And how did it come about? Because 8 years earlier, 3 rabbis had gone to the Dominican Inquisition, which had been set up only to uproot heresy in the Catholic world, and they said there was a Jewish rabbi whose writings are heretical, and they gave him, the Inquisition, the works of Moses Maimonides to be burned. Because they thought the Moreh, the guy, was heretical, and they thought that there were heretical teachings inside the Sefer Hamada, the first volume of the Mishnah Torah. 8 years later, the Dominicans then start looking into other Jewish books, and they end up burning the Talmud. One of those 3 rabbis realizes what a terrible thing he's done. His name is Yonah Gerundi, and he ends up writing a book called Sharei Tshuva, The Gates of Repentance, motivated by his repentance over having done this. The Rebbe, therefore, wanted to introduce a different standard. He really was not judgmental. It was not just a tactic. When Israel Meir Lau, who comes out as one of the major chief rabbis of Israel, was a young rabbi, he goes to meet with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, what sort of work are you involved in as a rabbi? He says, I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim. I'm involved in bringing near those who are far away. And the Rebbe's immediate response was, how do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachok? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far? They're all precious in God's eyes. It's a whole different way of looking at it. One of the people I interviewed for the book, George Rohr, is a major philanthropic supporter of Chabad, and he's also himself a highly knowledgeable Jew. He's a member of KJ, Kilas Yeshurim, where Rabbi Heskel Lookstein is the rabbi. And one year he started a beginner's service for the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur prayers. You know, a lot of Jews go into shul on Rosh Hashanah. They feel alienated. You know, they can't understand what's going on in the service. So at these beginner services, and you have one here? Yeah, okay, they have, you know, all over. What they do is they don't say all the prayers, but whatever prayer they do say, they make sure that people understand what they're saying and gradually introduce somebody to the whole service. So Rohr was very proud. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he goes to meet with the Rebbe, and he says to the Rebbe, I want the Rebbe to know that I conducted a beginner service for 180 Jews on Rosh Hashanah who have no background. And he could see from the Rebbe's face they didn't seem pleased with that response. So he thought the Rebbe, who was an old man by then, hadn't heard him. So he repeats in a louder voice, I want the Rebbe to know I conducted a service for 180 Jews with no background. The Rebbe says, what do you mean they had no background? They're the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. You know, again, he saw things on a different level. And I'll just conclude this section with the story that probably in many ways ultimately explained how I came to write the book, or what started me off. In 1986, I was living in Israel, and I got a call from my mother that my father, Shlomo Telushkin, had suffered, had a stroke, a bad stroke. And she told me to come home, and obviously I came home immediately. My father had been the accountant for the Rebbe for over 40 years. He'd been the accountant for the Rebbe and for the previous Rebbe from the time Chabad had come to America. Every day I would get 2 phone calls from the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is. My father, unfortunately, for 5 days was in a coma. And then he comes out. And the calls continue to come. And my father comes out of the coma, suffering left side paralysis. Fortunately, he was always able to speak. He didn't lose his voice. But he was a little disoriented. You know, prior to that happening, in addition to being an accountant, my father would give a weekly shiur and Talmud, and it wasn't going to happen again after that. So, but we continue to get these 2 calls a day, and then on the 5th day, I think it was, I get a call from Rabbi Krinsky, and the Rebbe has an accounting question for your father. So I said to him, Rabbi Krinsky, you know how sick my father is, he's in ICU. He says, of course we know, the Rebbe knows, but nonetheless, a question came up this morning at a meeting of the leadership, and he said, ask Shlomo. So at that point, of course, I go in and ask my father. He looks at me a little puzzled and answers the question. And I realized subsequently what the Rebbe had done. Sitting in his office in Brooklyn, dealing with these sort of world issues, he was also thinking about my father lying in a hospital bed, who was like a person running full speed who ran right into a brick wall. You know, in one day, in 1 hour, in minutes, you know, he lost professionally what he could do, his learning, you know, nothing again was going to be the same. And the Rebbe decided my father needed to do something that would make him feel useful. And he had to come, he came up with a question, which wasn't so easy, because he didn't want to ask a question that was so simple it would be condescending. On the other hand, he didn't want to ask a question that my father really wouldn't be able to answer. So he had the moral imagination to do that. And he had that constant moral imagination. I came across an incident of a 17-year-old girl that he had sent somebody from the kollel. She was in the throes of an enormous rebellion. And a rabbi, Shmuel Kaplan, the Chabad rabbi in Baltimore, worked with this girl. And she would write letters to the Rebbe, and he was amazed. The Rebbe would answer within a day or two. And then she writes a letter and about how great pain she's in, suffering. And we know the way teenagers can suffer, and she was really suffering. And the Rebbe says, I feel your pain. And instead of assuaging the girl, it actually antagonized her. She felt the Rebbe was being condescending. How can you feel my pain, she writes him. How can you feel my pain? You don't know what I'm going through. And that time Kaplan said, and he reprints what the Rebbe wrote back, he said that time the Rebbe answered within 2 hours. And he said to the girl, someday, God willing, when you merit in a few years to get married, you'll merit, God willing, to have a child. At the end of the child's first year, the child will start to teeth. And teething can be painful. And the child will cry. And the mother will cry with the child because she feels the child's pain. That is how I feel your pain. Kaplan said that statement somehow got to the girl. She did feel there was somebody who was trying to really comprehend her, and it started the path of transformation. So what I set out to do in the book is to identify a lot about the Rebbe, but particularly in these areas, the specific interactions with people, because I really interviewed dozens of people and others to try and come to an understanding of how one man could have had such an extraordinary impact. Usually when a charismatic leader of a movement dies, the movement goes into a decline. Chabad has tripled in size since the Rebbe's death, and I wanted to explain what's the background of what has led to such an extraordinary transformation. Okay, but now should I answer a couple of questions?